I hate you saying Sissy for Sissy's mom. And then Robert is their son, he'll be 2 December. And then George has a daughter.
I never
Will be 2.
You are currently streaming on YouTube, so we got that started. If you so desire, put that like in your breast pocket,
Right.
and then put that around your ears, and this all set up at a nice volume, so you should be squared away.
Okay, thank you.
Want to make sure
Thanks.
you're
Okay.
Have a good one.
Yep.
And then Betsy has a son here, and she'll be 2 in December. So, lots of cousins. In the studio, we're going after that.
Maybe those people that are over 70.
And we're on the Thanksgiving.
We can see y'all are sleeping.
That's why I am here.
We can see y'all are sleeping during class.
Well, we thought they were good looking.
I haven't seen it.
Here it is.
You didn't know that, that's the way to check to see if anybody's sleeping.
That's true.
Well,
I'd rather probably put it on. I didn't sleep well. I got to bed at 8 after 9. And I showered.
That was.
you are good.
Wait a minute, the clock is 5 minutes
Oh,
back.
okay. Whatever. And I had breakfast in the car.
That's pretty good.
That I made.
It's a good thing that you did all that. since you're on the street.
Yeah.
Well, that's where we are.
Boy, how's John doing? Mm-hmm. So good. How about the Lord?
Looks like we've got a camera facing the wrong way.
Well, maybe that's right. Or does it have to be on at all, or what we?
It's had it out here before. Find your
I got the
podium.
but I don't, the podium is,
missing.
yeah, that's okay. I can use that, but this, we ought to try and figure out what we want to do with, right?
I think.
I don't recall having seen anything projected there at other times, right? I mean, that is. This can be set up so I don't know which thing you touch to get rid of that.
Well, I've turned it around, so it's a matter of getting it out there where it will. I think John's had it up on a box in the past.
Yes.
Let's see, Doug, you're going to be right there. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Trial by fire. Which is what in America.
Euro was like $1.12.
Yep.
It might be better just to cut it off altogether.
So this is still. There's a lot of work in that.
Yeah.
Good morning.
How about you?
Did you check? I signed it.
Well, you're
Right. This is another package.
Good morning. Hey, good morning. How are you guys?
Okay.
Good, good.
So they make two bags.
Well, it sounds good.
Does he have to have a bag?
But you guys
So,
saw
yeah.
that. Oh,
Yeah.
We got it, no, we got these in Malaga.
But it's like the ones, I mean, you know. But that one has a lot of zippers.
I got to start on that phone. If she had to make it.
Thank you so much.
I'm kind of dragging this foot.
Pork is now $44 a yard, and you get 6 out of a yard. So,
Well,
plus 3 zippers. And the
maybe
zippers
they
are
feel
out.
less people.
That's all.
Since it doesn't have to, since it grows there,
And the
maybe they go up
40
40
is
together.
expensive.
They don't have to ship it, right?
$2.98 a yard.
It's like it's not shipped, but how you process it.
And so the- But over there, three sides.
They should have a label up that.
Hey, Reverend. How are you?
They weren't made. Can't be sure they weren't made. You can bet they weren't paying people a lot of money.
Oh.
Well, there is a little.
Go somewhere else. Yeah, so they stink.
Made in Indonesia.
Made it.
No, that's
We're still getting it on here, so that's good.
Hey, Barbara, did you get my message the other day? Oh, you're most welcome. I thought you were telling me about it. And
So you're gonna stand, you don't have your leg.
Yeah.
Right there, okay, see if you see me.
Yeah.
Are you happy?
We don't have any pets about it.
Happy enough. We don't have to be totally happy. Perfection is overrated.
The other thing is whether this says it's
Yeah,
not
there are.
here.
Yeah.
Probably. System off video music.
You're on.
Yeah.
Well, they have-
Can you hear yourself?
With Indeed.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
They should have a listen. Yes, exactly. Yes.
We good?
Oh, okay, yeah, it's pretty good. Yeah.
What kind of
Do you
string?
find it hot?
Hello, how are you guys?
What's going on with your foot?
Yeah, but is it hot, warm to wear?
It's, yeah,
I was gonna
it
say.
gets hot.
Cool.
Yeah, yeah. So the hat, the hat is over 3 feet.
Lives plus. No.
We haven't done anything.
So, I've already got Julie's last bill. I've already that makes me feel better. It may be good.
Yeah, I don't want it to be so down.
Yeah.
Just have a variety show.
Oh, is that? Is that?
I hate my.
That's today.
Well, has Ariel put it on?
You ready?
Whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you ready?
Huge thing is, when you come in the door, it flashes, you know, but you, by the time you look at it, well, this is everything. Well, I put that there.
You know,
Maybe a half mile in.
I'll talk to Ariel.
And
Yeah.
and it's just around areas that she doesn't get out. He does too.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It's time to get started. And I don't know about you all, but I feel like I had just completed a course at seminary, or they started the last session of it, and I hope we don't have any Sunday. Doug, thank you so much for these 3 weeks. I so appreciate you doing this. Next week, we will have the chaplain of Davidson College, Julia, will be here to talk a little bit about what's going on campus and so on. So I hope you'll come back. It'll be quite different, but it'll be good.
Think you can hear me now? Right. So we're in the third session here on Christian faith and politics. It's an illustrative go-around, so it's not comprehensive. There's a lot of other things that could be said about everything that we've talked about. So for instance, we selected some things, some Bible passages, but look, the Bible is a comparatively long book. We looked at talked a little bit about Exodus, Amos, some things in the Gospel of Luke, 6th chapter, and then the end of the book of Revelation. And that's a very, very sharp set of selections. What that set of selections was meant to do is simply catalog a number of different ideas or perspectives or views of a good society, or something like that, and politics. And so when you look at it that way, we can say that we have a variety of pictures in the Bible about life in the polis, or life in the state or the city before God. Polis being the root word of the word politics, right? So we want to take a very broad view of politics here and not reduce it only to what many of us are likely to do in early November, go to the polls and vote, which is, of course, also politics. So the biblical texts, of course, with Exodus, Amos, Luke, and Revelation. Just to review, if you want to see a positive review of what it is to be a nation state in the Bible, go to the book of Exodus. The basic story of the book of Exodus is slaves in Egypt are delivered from slavery, and they become eventually their own nation with their own laws. That's the premier saving event of the Hebrew Scriptures. It is social and political through and through. There is no other way to say that. It's not only social and political, but it is always also social and political. So when you get then to the book of Amos, you have a prophet who is criticizing the 2 kingdoms in the north Israel and the south Judah, in accordance with whether or not he thinks they have upheld the covenant and the law with respect to their society, their culture, and their political practices. He thinks they have not. He thinks they have failed to protect and treat fairly the poor and the vulnerable, is one of his major complaints. That's a pretty typical complaint biblically with respect to social justice. It's not a full theory of justice, but it goes something like this. People in positions of power are likely, basically because they're people and they're corrupted, to misuse their powers and to do that in ways that oppress other persons and groups. Whom are they most likely not to treat fairly? Answer, people who cannot prevent it. Who cannot prevent it? The vulnerable. And so you've got a quartet of the vulnerable in the Hebrew scriptures, which is widows, orphans, the poor, and the stranger within your gate, or the resident alien, all of whom are without resources to resist powers within a society. Okay. And that's a typical thing. So we see that in Amos. When we get to Luke, we have an account of some portions of the teaching of Jesus. The teaching of Jesus is centered on the kingdom of God. He enacts it, he acts it out, but he also proclaims it. And when he proclaims it, you get things like, blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. It's pretty direct. Woe to you who are rich, for you have received your reward. I'm just quoting Luke 6. It's not the only place to quote. There are other things going on. And then there are healings and so forth, because the kingdom of God is a circumstance in which persons are healed, right? Because all that stuff's there. I know the first thing that most Americans ask after a while when they see a healing is, can we historically reconstruct this story? Well, good luck with that. But whether or not you can historically reconstruct it, the stories are there to communicate something, and they're not there to communicate a modern notion of miracle. There is no modern notion of miracle. The modern notion of miracle is the interrupt universal laws. Well, unless you have an idea of universal laws, good luck trying to get that definition of a miracle, but you don't get that till Isaac Newton, and Isaac Newton is wonderful. And he's a part of our history, and it's an important conception. It just happens to come way after biblical times, okay? So we don't have that there. The big thing you want to notice about the healings is what they communicate about the kingdom of God. Right? And this guy who embodies it. Then we can try and figure out whether we can reconstruct those things historically later. But before we do that, let's just understand that that's what's being proclaimed there. The healings are part of a proclamation. Okay, so incidentally, so is eating and drinking with all the wrong people part of the proclamation, and it's explained that too. All right, so we did that. Once we finish and get to the book of Revelation, we have a very different view of state and government than we have, for instance, in Romans 13, where Paul tells you to pay taxes. Now, you know, also when Jesus tells you to pay taxes, that's probably not a direct statement to pay taxes. He's trying to keep from getting in trouble with people who are trying to trick him. So it's another matter, and you can look that up in the Gospels and see that it's not a strict teaching about paying taxes. But in any case, Paul does have a strict teaching about paying taxes and obeying government authorities in Romans 13. But then if you go to the book of Revelation late, it turns out that the same empire that Paul thinks you should pay taxes to is portrayed as a beast and a harlot and a fornicator and so forth that has to be destroyed by Jesus coming on a white horse with a spear out of his mouth to defeat the armies of the earth. I'm not trying to tell you to pick one of those. I'm just trying to tell you that if you want to talk about government authority in the New Testament, there is a range of pictures of government and what you should do with it. Basically, in Revelation, you should just endure it till it's over. Something along those lines. And then there are other sort of pictures elsewhere. And Amos, you should critique it, all that kind of stuff. All right, so then when we get out of the Bible, we get into some early Christian attitudes. We have Eusebius of Caesarea's life of the blessed Emperor Constantine, who was the first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire, and who was a very powerful emperor and does a lot of things. It is a life of a hero, is what he presents. And Constantine is terrific, and Constantine is Christian, and at that point you have a Christian empire, and so if you want to see good society, at least in part, what Eusebius is telling you is a good society is an emperor ruled by a Christian emperor, an empire ruled by a Christian emperor. And so and he's in the emperor's court, he participates in all that stuff and everything like that. It's, again, Constantine in the emperor's court. Jesus born and wrapped in rags after Caesar Augustus tells everyone to go to their hometown to be enrolled, and the little shot goes there and ends up with nothing. These are just different pictures here. You just want to see how different these things are. Eusebius is, of course, not a New Testament figure. We're talking like 300s now and stuff like that. And he is finally in the emperor's court. So they have a very different view. He tends to think of Constantine as a really positive and good thing. Now, at the same time that you have that, or just a little afterwards, you have Athanasius' portrait of Antony, who is the prototypical monk who goes to live in the tombs in northern Egypt, outside of town, doesn't eat much of anything, almost never sees anybody, doesn't want to leave his cell, is tempted by the devil in a variety of different ways, resists those temptations, and perseveres to the end, and stays in pretty good physical condition, according to Athanasius, even though he's in this cave, and performs a couple of miracles. And if you want to ask Anthony where the good society is, it's not on earth, really. It's somewhere else, and he's waiting for something else. So again, a very different portrait. You can take Athanasius' life of St. Anthony, which is a life of a hero, and just read it next to Eusebius' life of the Blessed Emperor Constantine as a hero. And, whoa, it's pretty different, you know? Now, they are connected in a way, because one of the things Athanasius wants to say is that Constantine hears about Antony and corresponds with Antony a little bit, which may be true. And there you go. So, I mean, one of the proofs that Athanasius has that Antony is favored by God is that, in fact, he corresponds with the emperor. So there's a little bit of that stuff in there, too. Hey, look, what authorizes or establishes or legitimates a religious figure? Sometimes being connected somehow to the halls of power is what does it. And you've surely seen that. I mean, if you haven't seen that, just go down to the Billy Graham Museum here and you'll see. There's just no secret, right? If you pray with presidents, people know who you are. Athanasius knows that. Okay, so you've got that. And then when we get to the Desert Fathers, we have another expression of this kind of ascetic spirituality that rejects the world. When you get to Augustine and the City of God, things change. And what changes? What changes in part is he may have for a while been kind of like Eusebius, but Rome falls. So if Rome falls, once Christianity has become the predominant religion of the empire, what gives? See, Eusebius is pretty clear that he thinks that Constantine is favored and the empire has peace and does well because Constantine is truly Christian and he's doing Christian things. Then the empire falls. And a bunch of old Roman senators who are still, sort of adherents of the older Roman religion want to argue that the reason it's failed is because you got the wrong religion. Hey, look, politics in Rome is sometimes not any clearer than it is in the United States of America. You just want to see, here's the arguments. Okay, worship the wrong thing in kablooey, right? And that argument goes all sorts of directions. So not to worry, it's a pretty typical thing. My guess, pretty much untrue in all of its forms, but there it is. And so Augustine knows that he can't just argue that. So what he argues is that in history, there are two cities, the city of God and the earthly city, and they're intermingled. The city of God is made up of those who are devoted to God and toward things like love of God and neighbor and so forth. The earthly city is made up of those who are devoted to their own glory and self-aggrandizement. Okay, and that's like a whole bunch of other stuff. And they are intermingled in history. And history is this sort of gray area between creation and fall and when the kingdom comes. So where you're located in here. You're not at the kingdom, and you're not about to bring it in. And you're not at creation, that's already happened in fall. You're here. So then the question is, what are your political possibilities? And you do have some. And he's for participating in the society and so forth. He himself is hears some cases as a judge and things like that. And he corresponds with military people at that point in the Roman Empire and so forth. What he thinks is possible is a kind of relative or comparative justice that's never complete. That's possible. You can get more and less just societies. You're not going to have a perfectly just society. You can get off of that one now as far as Augustine's concerned. That's not happening until the kingdom comes and you can't bring that in. But you can have that. And the other thing you can have is you can have an earthly peace, which he sometimes says can be, somewhat just and last for a while. And sometimes he simply describes it as an interim between wars. And that's what you have in history. So this is sometimes called Christian realism from Augustine. You can see why. He's not going to get like Eusebius and think things are hunky-dory as soon as you have a Christian emperor. Can't do that. History is eliminating that possibility. And he's not really comfortable with simply denying everything. He's got this other position. So that's Augustine, and you get the rule of St. Benedict. We talked about that, and that is the Benedictine rule. It's the beginning of monasticism in Europe. The big thing we wanted to notice there is that a good society is a society set apart from the rest of the world. It's in a monastery. There are roles that people play. To leave the monastery requires that you prepare for that kind of sojourn in the world. When you come back, you need to be purified. Within the monastery, there are certain rules that hold up. And when you have a council to rule the monastery, everybody has voice and vote in that council, and they elect their abbot, which means even the youngest brother does that, a proto-democratic thing. It's not the only place you can find them, but it's good to remind Americans that it can be found in monasteries, because that's not the way we tell our nation's history about ideas of democracy. It's okay, there are ideas of democracy in French philosophers too. This is also true, but okay, it's kind of fun. All right, so now we're going to go further, and we're going to go into the medieval period. Joachim of Fiore thinks the world's going to end soon. He's in the 12th century. The 12th century is a tough century. The Moors are in the Iberian Peninsula, what is now Spain, etc. Well, this is a major threat to Christian Europe. And it's a real threat. They didn't just make it up. It's how they get there. And there is controversy between church and state on choosing and installing bishops and abbots. This is called the investiture controversy. It's a major political thing because the abbots and the bishops are major figures who control estates. Sometimes they have armies, and they have major economic and political significance in Europe. And really, the political powers would prefer to have a voice in appointing them and not just have it done by the Pope. Now, when the Pope does it, different popes do it for different reasons, and sometimes these groups over here think, and probably is true, that there are political interests that are operating also with the papacy to appoint certain people, but of course there are also political interests operating when kings and princes appoint abbots and bishops. But the appointment of abbots and bishops is a major political issue, and it has to do with the way medieval Europe is constructed. So that controversy is not just a controversy about how to elect some minister of a Presbyterian church. I don't want to think it's great to be a minister of a Presbyterian church. No one thinks that electing a minister of a congregation of Presbyterian church is a major structural political thing in the United States of America. That's because it isn't. But electing a bishop or an abbot in medieval Europe, that is. Because what we're missing here is the major estate that goes along and the authority that goes along with being a bishop. Okay, so that becomes a big political thing that leads into the Reformation eventually. What happens in this period is that certain orders, monastic orders, are founded, and they are kind of they are interesting orders. That the primary one of interest is the Franciscans, right, from St. Francis. And they take a vow of poverty, and they want to live a certain way, and they are well thought of by a number of people who have about had it with contemporary dominant society in the 12th century. They think it's corrupt and kind of full of it, see? So what they would prefer is someone they can trust. Who can you trust? Someone who shows up without poverty. Also, a number of them somewhat educated, taking vows of poverty, Francis himself, and doing different things. So next time you have one of those little figurines in your garden, I got one of St. Francis, I kind of like them. I think I got one, I'm not sure, maybe I do. But anyway, nice guy, but also an educated guy who presents a political alternative. It's not just, he does like birds, but he doesn't just like birds. It's an interesting thing. Okay, so we have Franciscans. Now, Joachim thinks that the end is near. This is the third age, the age of the Spirit, Father, Son, Spirit. And things are coming to a close. And this third age, once it gets going, is going to be ruled by the Franciscans because they have poverty and they're truly moral. And the Pope will be the Antichrist. This is perhaps not the most popular thing for him to have said. He wants to talk about a perfect form of a monastery. And the perfect form, the monastery is also a society. It has 7 houses for it. And each one of them has a different group in them. So one of them has the spiritual, contemplative, celibate people, like, mystics and priests and monks of different sorts. Then there's other ones who are not completely sort of contemplative, and they read, and there's some of them that work different places. And you get down to the 7th house, you get families with children and who labor at that thing. So it's really no longer simply a monastery. It's a kind of model for, right, a whole society. And that's kind of interesting. I'm trying to check to see whether that was my phone, because it could have been. Yeah, it could have been. Turn it off. I'm not going to get a call now. I sometimes called my brother, who teaches at Loyola in Chicago, in the middle of his lectures, and he answers the phone. I try and think. I think he answers it because it goes off, and at that point, what are you going to do? He probably forgets and leaves it on. What I do is I turn it off, and then I forget to turn it back on, and then I hear from my wife later, says, why you have a phone? Okay. All right. So Joachim has this idea of perfect form of monastery, but it's really an alternative society in some ways. You just want to see that. Now, another reformer, Girolamo Savonarola, Italian, whose bust appears in the sanctuary of the Waldensian Seminary in Rome, along with a bust of Luther and Calvin. Luther, Calvin, Savonarola, they all face the Vatican. And you would probably do it too if you were a Waldensian, because you're tired of having too many people's heads chopped off different places. All right, so now Savonarola, approximately was born. We know exactly when he died, though, because it's a political event. He's a Dominican monk, right? So was Thomas Aquinas. He's a Dominican monk who denounces corruption. He's a reformer. See. When Charles VIII of France invades what is today Italy, which is not, there is no unified Italy until like 1873, right, or something like that, but invades the area. And Charles deposes the Medici, who are ruling in Florence, but he does it, and the Medici are out without bloodshed. And Savonarola, who had predicted revolution, thinks this is something of a miracle, that it was done without bloodshed. And he is also a big figure there, and so he helps them to put together a council, that is to turn Florence into a city-state with its own elected representative council. And he does that. Now, when he is talking about that in his writings, he replies to the tempter, who is Satan. And as Savonarola, he said. And Savonarola then replies to the tempter, who is criticizing Savonarola's efforts to set up a Florentine city-state for democracy. And here are the responses. I am not seeking the highest position for myself, but only recommending a form of government to the citizens. First criticism from the tempter is, you're just in it for yourself. And he said, well, I'm not. Second one is, it is not merely government of the crowd, but office holders for a fixed time drawn from the whole people. And that gives the greatest unity and peace. So it's not just democracy as rule of the masses direct. It's a representative democracy. And that means, one, that everybody is enfranchised because they get to participate. Everybody, males, get to participate in the selection there. It also means that the people who govern are representative of a wider group. And then third, the crowd does not govern directly. The elected Great Council does. And that's a group of people who are sufficiently, what he thinks, well appointed and educated to do it well, and also large enough not to be easily corrupted by tyranny. That's what he thinks. So that's Savonarola defending what he's trying to do in Florence. Now then, of course, political fortunes change, and the Medici back in power, and the papacy once again has power in Florence, and Savonarola is executed on the 23rd of May, 1498, which is why we have the exact date of the guy's death, right? All right, you want to be a religious reformer, there are times when it's a little dangerous. Okay, so now we have next here some peasant revolts, 15th and 16th century in Europe. These are taking place in both cities and in towns, in rural areas and in urban areas. They are somewhat related to trying to come up with cities as city-states, that is independent of a hierarchy of princes and such like that, and to have some kind of council that represents somebody in those cities. Sometimes it goes together with the emergence of mercantile classes, because they want to have a certain independence from this medieval hierarchy that's not particularly musical about business interests, etc. They half the time don't even think you can charge interest for anything. You've got a problem if you're trying to run a business, okay, and other things. They also are taking taxes and all that kind of stuff. So there is a problem there, but then also there are peasants who are revolting in rural areas and all suburban areas because the conditions are poor and they don't really have a lot of social prospects. Well, there's a figure named Thomas Müntzer, who is a Protestant and a reformer. Initially, he hopes for a new type of Christian prince. He writes about a Christian prince who will be more musical with respect to these sorts of things. But what eventually happens in his writings is that he turns toward a more radical transfer of power to the poor. That's what he wants to see. Thomas Müntzer, incidentally, is a theologian whom Marxists love and write about in adoring terms, because he understands that the poor are in trouble here, and that it is part of morality to ensure that doesn't happen, and that we ought to change political structures. So Thomas Müntzer has very good press in a lot of quarters, and has pretty good press in some Protestant quarters too. But in any case, you've got that. So he eventually ends up commanding the peasant militia, go into battle against some of these princes' forces, with banners that have biblical quotes on them or something. Okay, they lose very, very bad. Right? I mean, they go up against princes' armies that are actual armies, and they're carrying these things. Right? And he also is captured. He's tortured, and then he's executed on the 27th of May. So he got 12 days between going into battle and then there he goes. And there are accounts of his trial, and you don't know what to believe on it and all that kind of stuff. But so he buys it too. And then you have Luther on the revolts. Now, Luther is not really for the peasant revolts. He's very much against them. He writes a treatise that's really unfortunate, but it probably came out after these massacres. But in any case, he's really for the use of all sorts of power to put him down. Very conservative social ethic. We want to remember that Luther is in Bavaria, and he is at the court of Louis the Bavarian, and so he is pretty closely associated with one of the medieval hierarchies and courts. That's perhaps not a complete explanation for what he's doing. I think it isn't. There are other things, but we have that. Now, then there's a later generation radical Protestant, someone like Peter Riedemann, who is a Hutterite. You know, Hutterite communities are pacifist. There are some in Canada. They're mostly in Canada because during the First World War, when they refused military service, they were subject to prosecution in the United States. So they moved out of the Midwest to Canada where they wouldn't be prosecuted. You know, they have, again, large estates, right, with people living together. It's not entirely different from some of these medieval things that we've talked about. Same thing with of course, Amish in Pennsylvania, things like that. So then we have this later generation, Peter Riedemann. He supports an alternative Hutterite community. It's alternative because you only participate in the predominant community in limited ways. So you pay taxes, but you don't pay taxes that go to war. And that distinction can sometimes be made in the medieval period, perhaps not always. And then, for instance, can you be a Christian and a prince? No. Or if you are, not for long, you have to choose, because you can't wield the power of the sword if you're a Christian. You cannot do that. And that means that civil government and offices are not available to you. Can you be a Christian and a lawyer? Not even close. Because that's just coercive power in the law. And can you be a Christian and go to a law court? No. You know, things like that. And can you make swords? No. Can you see the answers you're going to get there. They're somewhat like the answers you would get from Amish and that sort of thing. So there is participation in the broader community, but it is somewhat piecemeal. The community holds its goods in common on the reading of Acts, which you can get out of some chapters in Acts and so forth. And that's what that is. So these are movements that are surrounding that. Now, John Calvin, later, right? So John Calvin's going to arrive in Geneva from France in 1536. When he arrives, he's already educated. He's a French humanist scholar who studied law and philosophy in France, and he's gotten himself in a little bit of trouble by writing an early edition of the Institutes, which at that point could fit in your pocket in a jacket. And it was a kind of movement book, you know, a Protestant movement book. He's impressed by Luther and some other things. There are other humanists at the time who are also interested in reforms, and some of them remain Roman Catholic. Erasmus of Rotterdam is one of those, a very famous humanist and a Renaissance humanist, and there are others. In any case, he is a French humanist who is also a Protestant who's also a French humanist, however you want to say that. He goes to Geneva in 1536. When he gets there, the city of Geneva is already an economic center. Now, it's not the biggest economic center, all that, but it is an economic center. Like what? I'm trying to think. Probably not quite, not as significant as St. Louis would be in the United States today. Got to think of a city that's an actual city. It has some commerce, but it's not that big a deal. That's a little remote. That would be Geneva. And it's up there in the mountains, so it's hard for people to get at it. And they're independent because their army has gone into battle to become independent from the Duke of Savoy and beaten them. And they are now part of a kind of Swiss League with Bern and other places. And they are a weak sister in that partnership there. But he is there. And his major work, the Institutes of the Christian Religion, went through multiple Latin and French editions from 1536 to 1559. There's some after that, but they're stabilized. They don't change from 1559. And all of them have a section on civil government. And part of the reason they do is because it's a major question of the day. I know we probably don't think of it that way, but again, think of something like what we just said about the abbots and the bishops and the investiture controversy. The political implications of changing ecclesiastical horses in this particular environment are very, very high. So how the church relates to commerce in the state is always a big deal. And so he's got something about that in every edition of Institutes. He wants to say that civil government is worthy of participation in a high calling. You see, that's very different from Peter Reed. And that's because he thinks that God governs in the world, not only through the church, but also through other avenues, and civil government is one of them. God doesn't always do exactly the same things there, but okay. So this is a high office and calling. You're supposed to do it. It's worthy. It is as important as air and water, he says at one point, for human communities to have a civil government. He also wants to say that it has some chief tasks, and he talks about that a couple different places. Maybe one of the summaries is simply that it's supposed to provide, quote, a public manifestation of religion that may exist among Christians, and that humanity be maintained among men, which can be expanded into a set of laws that are humane, etc., and do different sorts of things that have to do with justice. He will say further that of the systems of government, he's got three, right? This is a classic thing. You can have monarchy, aristocracy, or democracy, like straight out of that in Greek philosophers. A little bit like what you see Savonarola arguing about with the tempter. He says he prefers a system compounded of aristocracy and democracy. He prefers that to monarchy or to straight aristocracy and democracy or rule of the masses. What he means is something like what Savonarola meant. A group that's a council that governs, that is elected. That's not direct government of the people. Surely everyone here recognizes that, right? I mean, it's like you can now register for your passport online, but did you make that possible yourself, or did? Of course not. That's something that a government through agencies, etc., has done, and that's, I think, probably a helpful thing, comparatively benign thing, but I don't control that kind of stuff, and you don't control it either. So it's not direct rule of the people. It's through representatives and a series of bureaucratic things and institutions. And that's more or less what he prefers. He's going to give you his reasons. And here's an indication of reasons. For if the three forms of government which the philosophers discuss be considered in themselves, I will not deny that aristocracy, or a system compounded of aristocracy and democracy, far excels all others, not indeed of itself, but because, and here are some reasons. One, it is very rare for kings so to control themselves that their will never disagrees with what is just and right. They're a little too just juiced up about their own interests, right? And you can't trust them, just one time. Next, or for them, that is the kings, to have been endowed with such great keenness and patience that each knows how much is enough. They're also imprudent and they make mistakes. So one, they're overly interested in their own private stuff, and two, they can be stupid. All right, so there's two things there. Therefore, men's fault or failing causes it to be safer and more bearable for a number to exercise government. Men's fault or failing. It's not just kings who tend to pursue their own isolated interests when they have the opportunity. And it's not just kings who can make mistakes. It's everybody. And so this goes to what? It goes to a doctrine of sin or corruption. And since people are sinful and corrupt, it's better to have a group exercise than just one. Okay. Why? So that they may help one another, teach and admonish one another. And if one asserts himself unfairly, there may be a number of censors and masters to restrain his willfulness. Okay. That's why he prefers a representative democratic form, as you know how to put it. So that there can be more than one person. You can't really trust one person too much to do anything well all the time. And you want to have this kind of form of government, not because it's perfect, not because there won't be difficulties, yes there will, but because you want to restrain certain tendencies. Okay, so now we could expand this into a big argument about politics and democracy if we want to. And Calvin has some things to say there. Constitutions, he says, should be based on a general sense of equity or justice. Stuff like you should treat others as you would like to be treated, and a general sense of fairness. But what he's going to claim is that a general sense of fairness in the golden rule is not enough to run a whole society because it's too general. And you can't run it that way. So you have to have a bunch of other laws, but those other laws should accord with this. Nevertheless, these other laws will differ from place to place because circumstances differ. Right? So, for example, he's not going to use this one, but he does talk a little bit about usury and lending money interest, which he thinks you can do. But in any case, within limits, I guess. Take something like a law about insider trading that we have, right? So that's supposed to be your duplicitous because you're using information that other people don't have, and you're advancing your own interests in this that others cannot, and this kind of problem. You will surprise no one, right? That the idea of insider trading doesn't occur in all societies because most societies have not had financial markets, so there would be no reason, right? Does it accord with the rule of fairness? Someone could argue that it accords with a general rule of fairness, but it's not itself repeated in all societies. Okay. That kind of thing. Then he also wants to say that people should obey even bad rulers. So you've got to have order and law, and just because a ruler is not good doesn't mean you should obey them. But then says, but God vindicates the right against the unjust, and does this through a variety of avenues. One is unwitting agents. That is, people who are pursuing other ends but have the effect of getting rid of something that's unjust. Okay, that's fine. And that's God acts that way. You're not necessarily justifying the unwitting agents. You're saying, God is okay. And then there are also open avengers who know what they're doing and do it in the open. And his example there is Moses. So then he ends up with a Latin, and the Latin is pretty impressive because be afraid is terrantur in Latin, be terrified. Let the princes hear and be afraid, because God can come get you. Now then we have some other things. Duties of magistrates. Magistrates who have a position in government have their duty to protect people, right? But if the kings become willful and do things that are bad, then it's the magistrate's duty to resist. So it's possible to have someone resist in that way. There is the question of revolutions against authorities, and there are a lot of different things, and there are different things in Calvin. He tends to be more conservative than some of the people studying there, who tend to say there's some Presbyterians, and also some Puritans who study there, and they, of course, are favorably inclined toward the possibility of revolution. And they're in his seminars, too, so they're talking about that. Puritans, last little historical group, are Calvinists of sorts. They are anti-hierarchical and anti-monarchic, right? They're going to cut a king's head off, all right? They're against hierarchies. You want to know one of the reasons why the Presbyterian polity is as it is, so you vote on everything and all this kind of stuff, and you don't just give all the power to the minister. Here it is. It used to be, what I would refer to as the good old days, that the ministers had voice but not vote in a session meeting. Now that has been revised in my lifetime so that the minister has vote and voice. But if the minister has any sense, the minister will not exercise that one vote in highly decisive ways because it will result in a loss of political sort of happiness, and you shouldn't do it. But in any case, and then you notice if you're going to have a Eucharist in a Presbyterian church, the session has to approve the schedule. You're not allowed, as a minister, to haul off and do wildcat Eucharists. You got to have. These are all intentional things. But okay, anti-hierarchical and anti-monarchic. Puritans involved in 2 revolutions at least. And then the idea is that government is supposed to serve what they call the public good, by which they mean the good of all before God, or what they call the divine commonwealth, which is kind of a stand-in. It's almost like the kingdom. And Commonwealth is what they want to talk about. They're for Republican forms of government, right? I mean, that is, they're for the House of Commons and not just the House of Lords, and so forth. So that's what they're for. Their preference for Republican forms, checks and balances. They want to limit powers of government, other sorts of things like that. Serving, they also are for life in the polis before God, meaning that someone serves the public good in government, but also in one's callings and vocations, including like being a physician, being a parent, stuff like that. How does a physician do this? The chief end of a physician's service or aim is supposed to be the preserving of person's health. But if they only help those who are able to pay, then Richard Baxter says, now we don't think the chief end is simply preserving person's health anymore. It's give me some money. No good. Or if the physician never refers anyone else to an abler physician to take care of a condition that the physician doesn't know as much about, we begin to suspect that the physician is really most impressed with his, at this age, own reputation rather than. I used to think that last one was just crazy till I got old enough to visit physicians and then also specialists and see whether or not some of these characters have enough sense to recommend you go to someone else in time for something. And it was just a word to the wise there from someone in his 70s. You know, it turns out that this is not just an old-timey idea. All right, so you've got these sorts of things, and we could extend that into contemporary things. We have to take into account a whole bunch of institutional things, such as investments in medical corporations. I think it can be done in any case. It's not just directly in a sense. Okay, and then he's got stuff about families. Well, you got a lot of responsibilities, including raising your children. You're supposed to raise them to have certain sort of moral standing, and then also to be competent, right, to do different things and help them choose a profession. And this is because you care about the children, but it's also because eventually, as I think everyone in here is old enough to know, children grow up, and when they grow up, they participate in a society, and well, then there they are, prepared as they may or may not have been to do those sorts of things. And the ambiguities of parenting are extraordinary, and who knows what everyone's experience is. And I'm not trying to say it's always positive or good. I know that that's not the case. But on the other hand, the next time you meet someone who looks like they're tolerably good about participating in things and honest and sensitive, you might just silently thank possibly their parents for having helped raise someone who can do that. And Baxter thinks that's true, see? So we have that. Now, that's another thing you would have to expand in some of these in a contemporary thing. But okay, so much for a bunch of history here. Just quickly, some guidelines for current politics, broadly conceived. One, political participation. This is shaded toward a Calvinist thing, but I mean, you should do it. And not only that, if you take the Puritans seriously, you really got no choice. These roles that you undertake, in fact, do have political implications for a wider society and how life unfolds. So that's that. And it's important to do. So your duties as a parent, for example, or as a physician are important duties, and they're not less important than the duties of a minister. We're okay there. Parity of vocations. All right. This is political participation in general. I think you could say tempered by a kind of a realism that also includes hope. So realism and hope, as opposed to what? As opposed to a kind of naive idealism, the right or the left, really, in something like our current environment, where people think they're going to enact this perfect thing, I don't know, tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock or on November 4th at midnight or whenever they're supposed to do it. You know, a lot of this development wants to say that that's probably not happening. And that you're in a time between, like Augustine said. And Augustine, you could almost regard that as a kind of confluence of both Eusebius and Anthony, right? If you were to affirm both of these things, you're supposed to participate, but you're not going to get a perfect society. And there is something more, and you shouldn't think this is the whole ball of wax. Don't turn political participation into an idol. It's a responsibility. It's a good thing. But don't get too juiced up. You know, I mean, naive optimism, a kind of idealism, a misplaced idealism, would be for these groups a mistake. All right, so, and with bad consequences, that people think they're electing Jesus or something, or they're electing the perfect ruler, and that's unavailable. Besides which, if you had Jesus as a ruler, how do you think things would go? Do you think the trains would run on time? Jesus has shown no proclivities toward bureaucratic political leadership. That's not a criticism, it's just a fact, right? And so if you elect Jesus, oh boy. So politics has to do with attempts at comparatively just societies. Representative democratic forms with elected office holders would be preferred. Dispersed powers in society. Civil government shouldn't own everything. If they own everything, you got a problem. If the corporations own everything, you got a problem. If one person owns everything, you got a problem. How do you deal with this? You disperse and separate powers. It's not perfect, but you just don't trust one thing to have all these powers, right? Okay. Then you have sin and corruption persist in all persons and groups. So there is an inordinate focus on partial interests, and these foci need to be restrained. So part of a political order is orders of restraint, so that people and groups can't just enact everything that they prefer. You got to put up with each other a little bit. I know it's tedious, but Calvin thinks better. Mussolini made the trains run on time, but he was pretty much unfettered by having to put up with anyone else. Occasional gridlock may not be the worst thing that can happen to you. In any case, that's a reformed thing to think. You should try to direct people in community toward a perpetual rule of love. The idea here is that if you care about a wider society, you don't care just about your own isolated interests. You have to have some commitment to a wider group and other people. So that's a way in which the rule of love has something to do with society stuff. Okay, who thinks things along these lines? Well, they've got a list of them there. It's almost everyone we talked about thinks something like that. Constitutions and laws are based in a sense of equity or justice, and they are also appropriate to particular circumstances. You want to ask about both. You do also want to understand that you're not going to get a perfect set of laws, but you want a better set. So you keep asking about that. You should pursue the public good, by which is meant, or the common good, as the Puritans will also say, is meant that you should pursue the divine commonwealth. The widest public is God and neighbor. You should pursue the good of this divine commonwealth in varied social institutions and roles and in government. There should be special attention also to the vulnerable, widows, orphans, poor, resident aliens, assigned to the Puritans, right, on that, and some other people too. And you would get something like that out of this history if you slant it a certain way, and it's been slanted here for you, toward this sort of Calvinist Puritan stuff. You see at the end, we spent some time there, and not necessarily in some other things. Probably defensible if you're talking about politics in this country, since those groups have a lot to do with it, but there are other things too. Okay? And that's it. And this does not tell you who to vote for directly, I don't think. I can keep you too far off the pace of certain preferences, but in any case, I think those are just sort of general ideas that you can get out of this kind of history. I'll try to answer anything I can, if I can, I may not be able to. Yes?
So I was kind of curious, this idea of John Calvin thinking that democracy and aristocracy should kind of be the right. How did he define aristocracy?
Aristocracy is rule of the fewer group who are equipped to do it, who are educated and so forth.
So are they elected in the democracy?
His idea would be that the Congress, for example, is an elite. That's an aristocratic elite. No matter what they tell you, they have been elected and they exercise powers directly that you and I don't, and we choose them to do that.
Ah, I see.
That's what he's going to do. Aristocracy isn't mean you're always going to think they're really bright.
Yeah.
The Puritans in Massachusetts were a bit less tolerant than they were down in Rhode Island. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, you've got all kinds of divisions there. So the Puritans are not one thing, and you've got congregational Puritans, separatist Puritans, and other establishment Puritans. John Cotton, who's pretty good on a bunch of stuff, but in Massachusetts, he wants to say that the state has an interest in maintaining true religion. Now then, they're very pleased initially to get Roger Williams to show up there because he's Cambridge educated and stuff like that, and that's in short supply, and he's a minister. But Roger Williams is a Congregationalist and separatist Puritan, and he don't want to go with that. So he argues that Cotton's argument is that the government needs to do that because people are sinful and they make mistakes. Williams says, yes, it's true, they're sinful and make mistakes, not the magistrate himself accepted. Everyone makes mistakes, and so you can't give that kind of power to a magistrate. People ought to have freedom of religion. The other thing is, if you start requiring certain religion, it's no longer genuine, no one really believes it, they're just coerced. So that doesn't work, and he gets booted out, he goes to Rhode Island. And Rhode Island is the first place in the West to allow for a kind of religious plurality explicitly in terms of some constitutional things, including Jews and Muslims, etc. And then, of course, he's a moving target when he says he goes along and stuff. So yeah, there are disagreements within the Puritan group. It's not uniform. They all agree that sin is problematic and they need to be restraints. They all agree that there ought to be representative things and stuff like that. But they don't agree on that always. And they don't agree on a couple other things too. And Williams has got good reasons for saying what he does, and they go all the way back. He's not a terrible innovator there. There's just splits within the Puritan movement from the get-go. Next time you're in Rhode Island, just park by one of those waysides, pat the ground. Pretty nice setup there, and you can thank Roger Williams for it. When you're in Philadelphia, you go to those pocket parks that are downtown, and you can thank William Penn for that. He's who designed that, and there are also certain ideas of the public that are involved in having those parks that aren't always maintained in either Philadelphia or Pennsylvania as things proceed, but he has these ideas. It's a Quaker. So I think we should have fun in the United States of America in the political season. It is, from a certain point of view, pretty entertaining these days. And you just have to take a step back to be entertained rather than appalled. But still, you have to say that, if this is terrible, but if a certain party had set out to make me feel better at this time of year, and that was its only objective, it could not have done better than nominate one of the current candidates for governor in the state where I live. And to me, no matter how things turn out, it will at least have been entertaining. All right. I'm not entirely sure how that happens, why it happens. There are two religious groups that have baked into some interpretations of how they operate this country. One would be some Christians that how states are looking for someone to blame for social issues, plus they are competitors with very different attitudes. Or different things. A lot of it is not what it's been. A lot of it is terrorism, not all of it is then, of course, there are some Muslims who, with respect to the question of Zionism and other things, their intentions. Why would it be so widespread that we are living without any religious traditions? it may be part of this. It gets baked into certain things culturally. So anti-Semitism in Western Europe is a big thing, and it gets ensconced in laws and all kinds of very political things and all that.
Yes,
And then, of course, you do have a group that is supposed to be different and more bluff because they're kept ghettoized to some extent. And they are thought of as the
So I want this one, we can
Yeah.
push it up,
we're
so
just gonna
I'm
have
gonna go around the other way.
to Muslim nations.
I'll meet you at the bottom.
So this one, you go downstairs over here.
Yeah, you can go around the building.
I like those students.
Well, that doesn't have railings either.
I know, but it's
I don't really know for
The thing is, I'm going the shortest distance, so this way she may, and she'll probably get there same time I will. Good job.
No.
So something like that, I think, it becomes highly generalized. It's because it gets baked into the laws and a whole bunch of cultural things.
That part.
So you don't have to be Christian to think in medieval Europe at the time, the only people who were allowed to earn money and interest are Jews. Then people turn and say, oh, well, look, they're banking, they're making all this money. Yeah, because that's the only people who are.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Stuff like that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Harassed her out of town.
That a friend of ours. She's
Thank
taking
you.
all of the wonderful.
Oh, thanks, man. Look, you had a lot of fun.
I have so many questions that I couldn't even, not questions, but thoughts.
Well, we get around to them sometime. I think that would be a good idea. Sometimes you want to have a session where you just talk over stuff
I know, that's-
without having.
Yeah, and my mind's going, where, I mean, this is such a direct line, where in society are people coming down on the things that we think are good if they don't have a tradition?
Well, that's a sort of big thing,
It
and the, maybe the disarray of Protestant mainline in this country recently has something to do with that. Of course, if you go back further and ask about what things were like when the Protestant mainline was healthy, it's a little scary too. So I don't know what to say there, but whether or not certain of these cultural heritages hold up under current services is a pretty interesting thing. There's a question of how you understand evangelicalism, which at points dovetails with this Calvinist stuff and other points doesn't. And then there is just this major stuff I think about a kind of commercial capitalist pressure on religious traditions and contemporary heritage, which is a very, very big deal.
Yeah.
And for certain, not to mention other pressures.
You only have to think back in your Chicago Fourth Presbyterian Church.
Right.
Where you basically hold a few.
Yeah, well, that kind of stuff is true. That's it. All that stuff is there. And, so, yeah, I mean, they have some good features to them. They have some other features.
I think I better take this.
What happens with slavery and abolition is all
All right, let's do it. All right.
So you're saying that now one classroom's doing this last
This is the last one. First things first. Can somebody go get that card and bring it here? Josh, can you do that? Can I trust you to get the card there?